Um, all right, there we go. So thank you for the introduction. Yes, as Brian said, I'm going to be speaking about flexible thinking and product management, and I'm very consciously not using the word agile, both because I'm not a huge fan of lingo, but also because I want to speak a little more broadly about how we were flexible about actually building out a team at JOKR. And also how we built a inherently flexible product, not just kind of a flexible approach to product management. And as Brian mentioned, before JOKR, which is a quick commerce company, for those who aren't familiar with JOKR, so it's 15-minute grocery delivery. I was at SoftBank in the investing and operating groups, and when I was in the operating group at SoftBank, I had interim product positions at WeWork right after Adam Newman had left. So I'm sure most people on the line can imagine the story there or know the story there. And similarly, I was at Oyo, which is another portfolio company of SoftBank's, which is an Indian hotel chain that was trying to expand in Latin America right when COVID launched right when COVID happened. So similarly, that was another obviously challenging situation. And I think in both of those companies, they had been through this hyper growth phase that for different reasons kind of came to a halt. And, JOKR has had its own kind of volatility. And the reason I really wanted to talk about this is obviously the business environment today is filled with volatility. And so I want to talk about really how some of the decisions we had made at JOKR, I can't take credit for them having been consciously very valuable for more volatile environments, but the effect of them, looking with the benefit of hindsight, is that there were a lot of really essential decisions we made that kind of served us really well in this volatile environment and as a volatile company in a kind of crazy industry. So just to get a little more into JOKR, so JOKR within the first 8 months basically of existing was in 8 countries in Europe, South America, and North America. And we had raised about $450 million in that time period. So when I say volatility, it can also be very positive volatility, right? It's very fast growth, which means, investors have very intense expectations of the company. Marketing then sets very ambitious objectives for the business. And typically what that then does, from what we've seen to tech teams, is that's when a lot of tech debt can accumulate because you're rushing a lot of work, and you're usually over hiring potentially. So the organization can get a little bit messy. So even though, this was a really positive time and a fun time for us, it was also a time that, looking back, I'm very grateful and can really recognize the two really essential decisions that my boss and one of our founders and the CPTO made, both with respect to building a team and building products super early on. So he had basically been told before there was anyone on the tech team, we need to have an app live within a couple of weeks across a few countries. And it basically needs to just be able to complete a transaction. So he hired a third-party development agency because he didn't want to rush hiring a team. And that agency built a throwaway app, which is this app on the left. I think it was even more basic. We didn't even have the banners in the first one, which we entirely threw away that code base. And that was the full intention. And I think because we had set that intention and expectation early, there wasn't, attachment to anything. But we threw away the front end and the back end, and the tech stack we have today looks nothing like what we had in those early days. And so I say that just because that context was really important, especially for me, because I was the first hire on the product and tech team, to then for me to be able to have the time to build some of the products that we built with the team and hire the right team. So in terms of building, I want to talk about building a team and then one of the products that we built in particular. So as I mentioned, I came from the financial services world. Before SoftBank, I was at other financial institutions. And so I didn't really know engineers. And I was tasked with we have to hire 50 engineers. in the next 6 months. And we had constraints, right? We were a startup still. So we didn't want to hire recruiting agencies. So in pure, millennial fashion, I went on social media and ended up reconnecting with a friend I had met 10 years ago, basically in college, who was a senior engineer at LinkedIn, who ended up, getting along very well with our founders and really understanding the vision and had the right skill set for a part of the tech stack that we were trying to build out. But there was a caveat that he wanted to be based in Israel. And he was very adamant about that. And at that point, we were in all of these colored countries on the left. So we had European operations, so it wasn't totally crazy, but there was no intention to have an entity in Israel. And what ended up happening is I made a proposal to our CEO that we should open a tech hub in Tel Aviv for different reasons. And we then said, this is again when we have like no tech team, right? We're going to have 3 tech hubs, New York, Germany, and Tel Aviv. And each is going to have a VP of engineering, and they're going to kind of build out their own teams, and they're going to cover these different areas of the tech stack. That ended up getting approved. And, that's all great. But I think like what's really important here to highlight is like our management was very flexible about opening up an entirely new country. We, at that point, didn't have an org structure. And whenever I would consider making one with my manager and we would talk about it, we would say, well, we don't want to lock ourselves into any specific roles in any specific places so early on. And we also like at first, could have followed a very rigid hiring process with HR, which we said, no, we actually want the VPs to hire their own teams and decide who they need to hire for themselves and kind of manage their own budgets, which is another kind of interesting way to have done it. So I think there were a lot of ways in which we were really flexible, but we were not flexible at all about the people. It was kind of like we find the right people, and that matters much more than where they sit in the entire world. That's basically been our approach to the team. And obviously, like post-COVID, that's something we can do, but that ended up, you could say all this is nice and like great, but I think looking back, it also had like seriously beneficial results to the business, especially with all the volatility that we ended up kind of seeing, right? So first, in 2 years, we had one of about 25 engineers leave by choice, which is very low churn by industry standards. And I really think this is because when you end up having these separate hubs with the VPs in each country that did all of their own hiring, there's a really close relationship that they had with all of their own people. And they ran their teams their own way, right? Like they used Jira differently. They managed sprints differently. I speak to them differently. They speak their own languages. It's a very there's very close subcultures in each of our tech hubs. And this is all also while we went from at one point being in 8 countries to closing 7 and only operating now in Brazil, which is where we are now. And we still have had very, very high retention. And I think, some of that is the benefit of literally having an ocean between people is when we had to close Mexico, which was a really important market for us. The Israel team, for example, of course, they care and they're notified, but they're able to really continue focusing on their work. And because of how we divided the products too, it didn't really change what they were working on so much. And so there was this kind of stabilizing effect of having people in geographically different places. And then finally, I wouldn't say we hired so quickly, but considering like the quality of people that we hired that ended up staying so long, we did it in a few months, and they were all turned out to be kind of the right fit, which was really essential at that point, because yes, we had some time because we had this third-party agency, but we still had to build out teams very quickly with the expectations we had. And I guess, we're all product managers here. So in terms of product, I want to say that I'm relatively newer to product, I think, especially for the position I'm in now. And I think one of the benefits of being newer to product is that I didn't come in with a very like adamant way that we should do things. Like this is how we should write tickets. This is how we should communicate with the engineering teams. Like generally, I kind of followed the engineering team's leads in terms of what was clearly working well for their teams. Obviously now, a few years later with everything, I have my own opinions about stuff, but generally, I still think what's important for me to, like I say to myself, carry with me regardless is I think it's so important to remember that the process has to work for the people and not the other way around. And there's not like one way to be a product manager. My relationship with the engineering teams is very different in each location. And that's totally fine. Like it works. And so I think kind of letting that be what it is and being flexible ourselves is really valuable. So now I want to talk about one of our products. And, I think to give some context, again, it's how one of our products is very inherently flexible, which really is important. And when I compare to some of those experiences I had early on at WeWork and Oyo, the product hasn't required tons of adaptations, which is really important when you're changing markets and a lot of things are happening, because it's allowed us to keep focusing. And so just for quick context, I want to give a little more information on JOKR's vision, which also hasn't shifted the last few years either. But basically the idea of JOKR, and I'm assuming most people here in the States, which is more unusual for the JOKR, but I think about it like, and I'm in New York, Amazon is an impossible value proposition to really compete with in a lot of ways if you're in the States, right? You can get everything in 2 days at a good price point. They have an amazing assortment. So we're not competing there, but the idea is it's 6 p.m. on a Friday and I'm in my New York apartment, and I'm cooking for friends, that's me as the customer, I might run out of olive oil, and that's when I would need JOKR. And what happens then is JOKR has the context, like the data we're collecting involves the context around a user's purchase. So we know if Gabby is making an olive oil purchase at 6 p.m. on a Friday, it's likely because she's cooking on Friday nights. So then what we can end up doing the next time that user shows up is say, do you also need salt and pepper on, Friday nights? And actually both give customers a really good experience by meeting them with where their kind of intention is at that moment. But also, like, obviously for us, importantly on the business side, have the highest conversion we can possibly have by potentially reminding a customer of what they also might want at that very moment, which is presumably why they're using our product to begin with. So obviously to have this, like the idea then was to get to a point where we have 1 million customers, 1 million different storefronts, because what Gabby might want to see on a Friday night is different than what Joe might want to see on a Friday night. And that's different than what Gabby might want to see on a Tuesday morning. And so to do that, we said, okay, we want to invest our team's kind of engineering effort in building this tool called Heart, which is a video I wanted to show. So I'm going to have to do this really quickly. I think you guys can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So we broke that down to say, and I'll jump around a little here. There's different like container types you could have on an app, right? You could have a recipe, you could have a banner, and certain users might be more interested in recipes, certain users might be less interested. So that's kind of one way that content can be different depending on a user. You can have, I'm just jumping around, there's a lot of fields here. You can configure different flags. So you can hide out of stock products or show out of stock products. And that's, certain markets might think that can convert better or worse, depending on what you're doing. You can select content in that campaign in different ways. You can do it manually by saying, we want to show these 5 specific products, and I'm going to select those 5 products as the content marketing category management team. You could do it dynamically and say, we want to pull all products that are over 50% off, and we want that to be an outlet campaign, and that can update every day dynamically, right, based on the products that are 50% off that day. And then we have recommendations, which are some of them are machine learning models that our team built out that say, okay, other users like Gabby are very inclined to they buy oranges and Gabby hasn't yet bought an orange. And so therefore we're going to recommend Gabby an orange. So, and there's about 10 different recommendation models we have. So you have different container types, different ways of filling content, and then different ways you can schedule content to say, we could have it on the home page, on the search page of the app, on a category page, depending on how that user shops. It could be in this vertical position, this horizontal position. It could be, you'll see here, in only certain locations we want to show that content on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We could get more into this, right? And we could only want to show this to users who are vegan, right? So you can target. And my main kind of there's a lot there. I think we can dive into that if there are questions, but the main focus I wanted to clearly, the takeaway is there's a lot of configuration possibilities with a tool like that, right? Almost an overwhelming amount for a business team, but there's a level of the PM for the app as well. And there's a level of saying, okay, we're going to let the local teams decide what types of containers they want to show, how they want to fill a campaign, how they want to schedule it, and how they want to target it. And that's giving them all the flexibility. Obviously, there's times, and a lot of times, where we push that they need to test different configuration combinations for us to start learning from, which I'll talk about. That the vision was very consistent, right? And we want to be getting data on what different combinations of content look like for different user segments at different times of day, to be able to eventually get to a point where we can automate this, which is what we're starting to do now, and say, this is clearly what's working really well for users like Gabby in New York, and this is clearly what's working for users like Joe in New York. And then now we have our data science team working on how can we automatically create campaigns that are relevant to those users and when should they be scheduled. So the vision stayed totally consistent in terms of whether we built recipes first or second, or whether the countries program them. That was less important to us. And again, so that's very nice, right? But I think the value in looking back is that a tool like this, with this much adaptability, was really essential when I think about how much the business has changed in the countries we've operated in. Because what I saw at prior companies is if you open or close markets, right, that can totally shift a tech team's focus if you don't have products that are working well and can be adapted well in each market. So when we would close a market, frankly, obviously it's very sad for us and difficult, but it didn't totally change what we were doing as a business or totally shift our focus very often. Second, I think when you're building, at one point we were building these products for 8 countries, different languages, different stages of growth, they're all going to use the same product. And little things like even that out of stock toggle. I remember there was this very long email thread about whether we should show out of stock products in the app. And it just said, okay, let's just make it configurable, right? If Peru has a very strong view about it, that's different than Mexico, let's test it and we'll see if it works. And so in terms of speed, you need to be able to do that a bit. Otherwise you can end up in these debates over smaller topics potentially relative to the broader, keeping your eye on the broader vision. And third with countries is, something like recipes. Again, Peru consistently used, once we rolled it out, there were a lot of the views per day is the quick data I pulled, compared to Mexico and Colombia, which sometimes ran recipes, but they didn't have the right inventory assortment for recipes. And that was totally fine. We said, we'll roll out an MVP of recipes, get some feedback on it. We don't need all the countries to be ready, and we don't need to require they use it, or we don't need to feel like it's a wasted feature. There were ways to be collecting data in different ways in different countries because of all the flexibility within the tool. Second, I would say, is what we're doing now, which is automating a lot of this. So we have really awesome analytics on all of this, and over 1 million events per day, which is a lot on all these different combinations of content. So what conversion looks like, depending on all those different factors I just walked through in the tool. And what that's allowing us to do now is, like I'd said, create campaigns in a smart way and schedule them and target them in a smart way, which is the most important, with the idea being, hopefully we get to a point where most users who log into the app convert on content they see pretty much right away, which is, the way to optimize conversion for ourselves. And then third, which has been really important, is we've had some third-party interest in the tool, which is interesting. But more so, I would say on a day-to-day basis, we have a media team that sells, Coca-Cola wants to sponsor content to Brazilian customers. And they have the ability to do things like show a banner, which is, more standard, or sponsor a recipe, or, there's a lot of other, we have surveys also that are programmable through there. And they could say, we want to show this survey to users who bought a Pepsi. And so there's all these different sellable types of content, which you have Coca-Colas, and then you have smaller brands in Brazil that might want to buy something differently. And so we're able to cater to a lot of different third-party media, interests at different price points. And that's been really effective and important for us in terms of profitability. And again, just like the PM role in all of this, right? So if you're building this tool, which was, what I've been doing the last couple of years, there's a level of like, I don't know if all the local teams would fully agree because I push certain things all the time, but saying like, you guys get to decide. Each country team really needs to be trying different things. That's the most important thing from my perspective. But there's a limited, we're removing some control, right? As the PM and as the PM for that tool, they're saying, we're giving you all these different features and functionalities that we're really encouraging you to try. We're not requiring things, we're not locking things in certain positions. And that's really empowering local teams, which I think because I was newer, again, I wouldn't even feel comfortable saying this is the best way to do it. But I think that's really, that was kind of natural for me to not feel like I know, and it has worked well. So zooming out and kind of bringing this back to how I started and some of those earlier experiences I mentioned I had, I just wanted to kind of compare. I consciously didn't put the companies on here, but you talk about like the experience when I went into WeWork and Oyo after some of the crises happened, right? You had very high churn, which JOKR and Taki, we've had very, very low churn. The teams were huge, which meant there were lots of layoffs, which really impacts teams' ability, of course, to focus, and culture becomes really rocky at that point when you get in a position where that has to happen. Because we've had a pretty tight, lean team this whole time, the tech team was less impacted by some of the changes that have happened in the business. And then generally, of course, when a team size is pretty big, you have to kind of justify the size of the team. So you start building everything versus buying some. And obviously, we invested heavily in certain tools at JOKR, like the one I just showed you. But we also said things like search, right? Like that doesn't need to be our differentiator. There's plenty of really good search engines, and that's not like where we need to put a lot of engineering power into. And again, that's really kept us focused. But I think like the most important thing is actually product's role, because I was very much, and the product teams were very much in firefighting mode when I went to those companies. This country needs this product doesn't work well for this. We're changing direction now. And like, there was a lot of, you're reacting, right? You're just constantly reacting. And trying to figure out how to communicate effectively with the business teams. That was my experience there. And I would say at JOKR, one of the things I'm really most proud of is we work very closely with the business teams, and not at all in a reactive way. Like, we build these tools, we're generally showing teams more so how to make the best use of the tools, and how to kind of together come up with the most optimal strategy that works well with these tools, or how they can then guide us on how we should be like enhancing things. But I wouldn't say we're constantly bombarded with feature requests in the same way, or bug fixes at all, which again makes for, as a PM, a more interesting job, but mostly also just like a more kind of friendly, collaborative work environment. And just finally, on like a personal level, I think you can make an org structure, is like right? You can plan that you're going to control all these elements of a product. But I think when things are more hectic, when you're closing markets, when you're having layoffs, when you're having all these hectic times, you kind of have to be ready to like toss all of that, and know what's important to keep. And in our case, right, as I said, it was the people, the fit of those people matters much more than the location. That was in our case. It could be different at a different place. And obviously sticking to the vision, which for us never changed, also was essential to keep despite business changes. And then secondly, obviously the trend in terms of the product role here was there was a letting go of control, both with, exactly how products were going to be used, and also even in the team case of saying, okay, the VPs are going to have their own subcultures and manage and hire their own people, and we'll adapt with that. So with that, I will wrap up and see if you guys have any questions, but thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, please, everybody, if you have questions, I'm sure you do, say Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screen. So you can put your questions in there and we will get those read out as soon as they're in. But I will kick us off here. I have a bunch of questions, which I thought there was a lot of really interesting stuff in there. I actually wanted to start off with the last slide you showed.
Oh, yeah.
You had the statement there of, kind of letting go of control is one of your kind of personal takeaways. I think that is one that I in conversations I've had, at least, it feels like it resonates a lot with first-time managers and leaders and, people who are kind of just stepping into a space and that struggle with how much do I micromanage versus how much do I allow to happen without my direct oversight is one that I think a lot of people have to figure out how to navigate in their first, however many years or months if they're lucky. So I'm curious to hear more from you. Like, how did you get to that point? What were the learnings, or what is it that you think about you as a leader, made that possibly easier to understand that you needed to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, and I think it was really beneficial for me that I didn't come from product. So as I mentioned, I was in these interim product roles at SoftBank, but otherwise I had been an investor, and like my first job was in investment banking. I wasn't like a tech, I hadn't worked at other big tech companies. And what comes with that is I kind of knew, like, there's obviously different types of PMs, right? Like I was clearly more of like a business-minded PM, right? And I knew, like, when you're newer, you tend to come in with a beginner's mindset that's a little bit different, right? That's where I hope I can kind of maintain that, because you're really like in a learning mode and trying to follow the lead of your engineering partners and the business partners you're working with. And I think I almost like, I don't feel like I get credit for that almost as a minute, like that it was like a conscious decision as much as seeing like, this is clearly working. And I remember there being a couple moments, like, I think the team example is interesting, where I realized the New York team, for example, there's like 8 engineers who I speak to every single day directly, and I much more closely kind of manage their very specific work. The Israel team, I talk every day to the VP of engineering, but I don't speak as directly to his direct reports. And there have been moments where I've been like, is it bad that I don't, have as close of a relationship to them? And then I've talked to that VP and said, like, should I be more involved? And he's like, it's working well for us. And I think then there's a level of like, great, like that's fine. Like, I don't need to have the exact same relationship with people in different places, but there were sometimes times where I would like check myself in that way and make sure, am I like neglecting the other people or what, like you have to kind of ask for feedback along the way too, to make sure like your own intuition about what's working and not working is accurate, right? So I think the constant open feedback is super important. And similarly with the business teams, I think there's times where we've given a lot of leeway on how things are managed in the app. And now is a time when I'm very adamant about us testing different things, because we're really focused on getting towards automation. So again, that's where I don't even care that much about what we test, but I know it's important for us to test to be getting enough data that we need to do that. So I think it's like picking what's important and then kind of rolling with the rest of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not to put words in your mouth, but I think when I think about that, at least personally for me, like it comes with an understanding that you're also opening yourself up for like risk or hurt, or depending, how much you invest your personal worth in work, I suppose. But knowing that, somebody else may do it differently, may do it worse, may not get it done at all, right? But still being willing to put that to empower them to put that, faith in them to get that job done, I think takes a leap of faith on your part. I'm curious whether I don't know, again, I'm kind of putting words in your mouth. I'm curious how you think about that.
Like, and you mean kind of trusting that what they're saying is also like kind of, you mean the going with the flow being a bit of a leap of like faith, or how do you mean, Ellie?
Yeah, sorry, to clarify, I guess I mean in the sense of how much of this depends on kind of personal relationships and having faith in that you've picked the right people.
Yes, that's a very important point that I left out. I think part of it you could say is luck, but I was also involved in hiring our VPs of engineering, as I mentioned, and I would say they've probably been the most essential part of my job. By far, the VP in New York, and I work with the New York, Berlin, and Israel team, but I work very closely with the New York and Israel team. And yes, I think that is actually the right answer, is there is a huge level of trust that's kind of been established. And those two relationships have been probably the most essential. Partially, I would imagine if we were in one country, some of the business relationships would have been really important. And a couple of those have been super important. But in terms of the day-to-day kind of product management, like the relationship with the tech teams and whether I'm doing a good job with engineering, they are both very honest with me, sometimes in tough to hear ways. And that it's a very respectful, I think there's a lot of mutual respect. And even though I didn't come from product and they knew that, and they've been engineers for 15, 20 years, I think they really did respect my perspective. I knew the business so well from being so early on. And I think they respected my kind of business understanding, where they would ask me for feedback or trust my judgment in that way. And I would lean on them a lot in terms of what's working well with their own engineers, or whether I'm, communicating effectively. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be different I think whether you like the person or not, establishing those close relationships and investing in them heavily is huge as a PM, right? Like, it changes your day to day and your enjoyment of the job tremendously. So
yeah, agreed. Cool. I'm going to keep firing questions at you unless anybody has some. So please, if you do, get them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. I wanted also to touch on I think the first topic you talked about of the intentional decision to launch kind of a throwaway app, which to me, I feel like that's the first time I've kind of heard of that thought process, but it seemed very interesting and certainly effective, in the example you provided. I'm curious for the, maybe edge case, but where those of us in the audience would have to think about, how would I navigate that decision? Do you have any insights from that experience of like how you might pitch that at a new company in a new situation? Like, should we do this or should we not do this?
I would, like, if I started a company, I would probably do the same thing. Depending on, the only caveat is, right, like we had to go live really, really quickly, right? Because they had raised a lot of money really quickly. And that's what it was. I think there is a close relationship between investors, and this is where kind of what the world I'm from. Sorry, this thing is moving, so I'm going to move it. It's distracting, but the investor expectations with marketing expectations with tech expectations. So I think it really depends on that. Now, like, obviously you want to set as high expectations as you can for the business and for your tech team without not being able to execute effectively. So I think to the extent kind of all, cylinders are ready to fire, and you have a marketing team ready to go, and you have the funding ready to go, obviously you want to go to market as quickly as possible, or it's costly, right? Especially if in our case, we were in a competitive environment. And so the question then is like, I wouldn't have it necessarily be a delay, but to build the product you want. But more importantly, even if you can build, I almost think this bought us the time to think. So whether or not, even if in theory we could have this beautiful app ready on the first day, there's a level of thoughtfulness that you just can't have that effective, that quickly. And to be able to watch the business working with a tech product that isn't the one you invested so heavily in, it gives you a lot of mental sanity, and you can learn a lot from just watching things like what's working, what's not working without it having been a high cost product. So I think it's like, that's, to me, at least I've understood agility is like you're going to market, you're making this as agile as possible for yourself to then say, okay, this we should totally change the layout, or maybe we don't even want to be in food delivery anymore, right? So I think it's just avoiding I don't think that would have happened, but that can happen, right? Companies pivot a lot. And I think what was really important though, that I should say is like, whenever you do that, you have to set the right expectations, both with the tech team and with the business, because people get very attached to what they're used to using. So we had like a Shopify backend for that product, which now we don't have at all. That meant that like all our store locations were using a Shopify inventory management system, right? And so there's a lot of change management that you have to be ready for. So the one caveat I would have is like that you're ready to communicate the why you're doing this very effectively, because otherwise you could get met with a lot of resistance and people may not understand, why'd you build that first thing if we're not going to use it, or why do we have to relearn a new tool internally? And so I think if there's not the willingness to do that, and that willingness of the business, like I think the alignment with the business on that is so important for it to work well.
Yeah. And I think you anticipated a bit in there my follow-up question, which was how much effort did you put into instrumentation and understanding what worked and didn't work within that throwaway app to make the in-house version better? So it sounds like there's at least some deliberate intention paid there.
Yeah, I mean, my boss says the app, I don't know if this is, he says the app is kind of like Barbie and the back end is Einstein, which now there's the Barbie movie, so I have to be careful with that. But that the app itself wasn't necessarily what we learned so much from, like a little bit, but right, it was a very basic transactional app. It's a very, for us, it was a very capital intensive business with lots of inventory, lots of store locations, and how the teams internally interacted with the products that fed into the app was where we really learned a lot, and how we should handle inventory management and a lot of the kind of less sexy parts that aren't as visible. It gave us time to learn how the operations of the business were working. And that's where I would say the learning curve was probably the steepest.
Got it. That makes tons of sense.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we are pretty much at time. I don't see any other questions that came in, so apologies for dominating the entire Q&A, but appreciate your thoughts there. Yeah, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.